Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. I'm going to start this talk with a confession. This is one of those interviews where I've just torn up all my notes, thrown them away, and started all over again. In a moment, we're going to talk as advertised. Well, in a bit, we'll talk about, as advertised, about Putin's problems that he's having with the war at home, all the problems it's causing him at home. But I want to focus on a bigger question, and that question is how the West handles Russia, whatever the result of the war in Ukraine. And that's the focus of our guest's latest book. He's Keir Giles, a senior fellow at Chatham House and the director of the Conflict Studies Research Centre. And this is his new book, Who Will Defend Europe? Hello and welcome, Keir.
Hello again.
Good to have you with us. This book asks a very straightforward, well, makes a very straightforward point. It says that simply that Russia is intent on attacking Europe. Whatever happens in Ukraine, can Europe defend itself? And I want to start off by taking you back to 2010 as an example of Europe's approach to this problem. What were you doing back in 2010?
Well, April Fool's Day 2010 was when I and the team that I was working with within the UK Ministry of Defence, effectively the Red Team for Understanding Russia, were disbanded and moved out into the private sector because, partly because of some self-inflicted organisational injuries within the MOD, but also, of course, because Russia at the time was simply not a priority. So you didn't really need to understand what was coming down the track from Moscow. Since then, we've operated completely in the private sector. We essentially carried on doing the same Russia forecasting and prediction and saying what Moscow was going to do next, but sending people a bill at the end instead of being an in-house resource for the MOD.
And that's something that's continued over time, but we're going to come back to this in sort of dribs and drabs, if you like. There is, you say, a perfect storm. We're well aware that the new American president is not interested in Ukraine, is not so interested in Europe, and at the same time, it's very clear to us that you've got an aggressive leader in the Kremlin. But Europe's reaction just seems to be sclerotic, and that's really the focus of the book. I mean, Chip, one thing I think one of the questions you first pose is why is it so difficult for Europe to imagine a conflict like the Second World War, or even something on a smaller scale?
Yes, that's right. It's one of the key elements of that triple challenge that we've got at the moment. It's that combination of those three circumstances, that Russian determination, US distraction, and European denialism that altogether make this such a dangerous situation. And the reason is primarily because for so much of Western Europe, the concept of war happening to them, happening to their own countries, is so impossibly remote for a generation of politicians and decision makers who have grown up accustomed to the idea that Hitler and Napoleon were from previous centuries. There are no megalomaniac dictators that are threatening the continent today. And war is something that happens thousands of kilometers away and affects other people. It's never going to touch the homeland. And that's been an incredibly difficult mental barrier to overcome. Because of that, you see still this pronounced gradient across Europe running from east to west, from the countries closest to Russia, which understand the threat and are investing urgently in their defense, military defense, civil defense, keeping their societies running when Russia is attacking them, across to Western Europe, which is still largely in denial about the problem, partly because they think mistakenly that they are isolated from it by distance, and partly because it takes such a reimagining of the current state of world security and of the threats to their own countries to actually realize what is at stake and what needs to be done about it.
So can you give us some more examples of those contrasts, just in terms of, so for example, the Baltic states and then France or maybe in Italy or Spain?
Well, you mentioned the book. The title is Who Will Defend Europe? And after the first few chapters, which are spent pointing out why the people we expected to defend Europe are actually in no position to do so, whether it's Europe's old military heavyweights, including the UK or the United States for various reasons, all going to be out of the picture, we look at the frontline states and those countries that are showing the way and setting the example for what needs to be done today. And in terms of defense investment, in terms of the straightforward numbers, of course, the poster child is Poland, which has has engaged in this crash rearmament program. Forget about NATO targets of spending 2% of GDP. They're climbing through 4.3% of GDP and still going strong because they understand that while that is expensive, the costs of not doing it are potentially existential. The cost of deterrence is high. The cost of not succeeding in deterring is vastly, vastly higher. So they say, can we afford this? Well, we don't have a choice. We have to keep Russia out. And if we fail to deter them, we have to be able to withstand them when they attack. Contrast that with, for example, the UK, where there's been this consistent, not only refusal to increase defense budgets in that kind of transformative way, but even pretending that the budget has increased when in fact it is decreasing, which has been the persistent practice. And we have example after example in the UK government's approach to this that you'll find cited in the book. It continues under the new government as well, an apparent complete disinterest in defending the country. And that extends really to very practical matters as well. Russia's demonstrated how distance is not, in fact, an insulation against what Russia can do, because it's practiced reaching out at exceptionally long distances to deter or to coerce by launching missile strikes against civilian targets. That means that any country in Europe that is not kept up to date with its air and missile defenses is an inviting target, let alone those countries in the far west of Europe, like the UK, that has no integrated air and missile defense at all and is in effect wide open to this coercion and deterrence.
You describe the West as having overestimated and underestimated Putin. What do you mean by that?
Well, this does go in cycles, and it's not just Putin, but it's also Russia as a country and Russia's armed forces in particular. And we saw examples of this in and around February 2022, when all of the forecasts, particularly from the United States, let me rephrase that, almost all of the forecasts for how the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces would go were unanimous, that this would be a walkover, that Ukraine would not be in a position to resist because the Russian armed forces were all-powerful. Now, of course, this was all the folks that had been focusing on what Russia was saying about its army while ignoring what had actually been happening for real in Ukraine. But still, it led to this impression that Russia successfully fostered that you couldn't support Ukraine, it would only make things worse. And that, of course, was almost devastating for Ukraine. There were only a few countries like at that time the UK, which stood up and said, no, the government in Kiev needs our support, and no, the situation is not hopeless, so we will give as much as we can. Then you had the catastrophic first few weeks of the full-scale invasion and the position reversed. Then you had people saying, well, it turns out that the Russian armed forces were really just a hollow shell. This shiny new army that you saw on the top concealed this rotting mass that had not really been overhauled at all. And in fact, you have an armed force which, just like in the late 1990s, early 2000s, is broken and incapable, and therefore we don't need to worry about it. So it has swung between those extremes. And you can see this pattern playing out not just in February 2022, but in fact over time, as all of the estimations of how well Russia had or had not done in its military overhaul program have come and gone. The situation we have now is most people's perception is lagging about a year or two behind the actual state of Russia's armed forces. It's true that the land forces were decimated in the early stages of the full-scale war, but since then, Russia has rebuilt them, not like the way they were before, not an attempt at a fairly highly trained, well-equipped force, but a force that Russia is comfortable with. Mass, numbers, warm bodies that you can throw into the path of bullets just to grind people down through overrunning them. And by April of last year, that army that Russia had in the field was already 15% bigger than the one they started the war with. So they have already reconstituted their land forces and their air forces, their naval forces, the nuclear forces, all of the ways in which they have of projecting power further than just driving to somewhere and invading it are still more or less intact. That's the problem we're dealing with. It's Russia's intent, which has not changed, and the capability, which was severely dented but now has been rebuilt.
You give another example in 2022 of the US pulling back its one of its headquarters in Europe at the same time. And this is actually when the war's actually started. Is that right?
It's slightly more complicated than that, and it's also slightly more alarming than that. Now, if you think about the whole question about NATO Article 5 and whether countries would honor their commitments under the North Atlantic Treaty to come to the aid of one of their treaty partners that was under attack, All of the question has been about, well, will they do it? If somebody calls, if there is an Article 5 discussion, which countries will actually move to respond? And of course, the big conversation most recently has been, what about the United States? Under Trump, would they actually honor their NATO commitments, or would NATO collapse like a house of cards because Article 5 is tested and doesn't hold good? Now, what I discovered in the course of research for the book was that we've already had a comparable situation. We've already had a situation where the United States should have moved, where US European Command was ready to respond to a situation. They were ready to move into defensive positions in case the full scale of invasion of Ukraine didn't stop at Ukraine, or in case there was widespread insecurity spilling over into other countries that needed the US forces to be present, and they were told to stop. They were told not to move forward, not to move into defensive positions, not to prepare for disaster, because that would be dangerous, provocative, and escalatory. And that is exactly the situation that is most terrifying for those countries that are on the front line, that up until now have been counting on the major NATO partners to come to their aid when necessary, that the United States might decide, as it did with Ukraine, that the better course of action is not to stand in Russia's way.
So how do you explain that? I mean, at the same when Putin launched the invasion, at the same time he lifted up his nuclear threat, having nuclear exercises, very much saying that if you intervene in this could be the possible response. So at the same time, you get a political message coming from the United States that we don't want to antagonize Russia. But I just don't see how that's why is that sense of Russian threat not wanting to antagonizing them at the same time as letting them make progress on the battlefield?
It's hard to see that unless you take a much, much longer view. Now, it is true that in February 2022, the nuclear rhetoric stepped up a bit, but it didn't start there. Instead, it built on a decade-long program of setting the conditions for that nuclear rhetoric to actually be received in Washington, D.C., in Berlin, in other Western capitals, as though it were genuine. And that's a long-term information campaign that actually unified all of Russia's levers of information warfare, right from President Putin at the top, down through the spokespeople, down through the agents of influence, the useful idiots, right down to the bottom feeders in the Kremlin's troll army, all pushing the same message, that if you stand in Russia's way, the inevitable result will be global thermonuclear war. And this was so intensive and so effective that it actually shaped the thinking of those Western capitals, and in particular, the United States, because time and again, you have had Joe Biden and those around him justifying the failure to support Ukraine, or even to allow Ukraine to defend itself to the greatest extent at its disposal, by precisely the narratives and precisely the ideas that Russia had been inculcating for all of those years. The fact that this would inevitably lead to a reaction which would spiral into the Third World War. All of those phrases that we saw first being used by these mouthpieces for Russia eventually resurfaced in pronouncements by political leaders on our side, and even service chiefs from individual armed services. And that has been a spectacular success in information warfare and reflexive control by Russia, because it allows them that freedom of movement, that freedom of operation to do things which otherwise would trigger a response from the West, and particularly from the United States, that Russia would not be able to cope with.
So how does that feed into the failure to have the threat of Article 5, the idea of NATO coming together if there was a Russian incursion on a NATO country, that threat is really no longer effective? How do those two, that lack of ability to stand up to Russia's nuclear threats, feed into the Article 5?
Well, first of all, on that lack of ability to understand that these nuclear threats are empty and there is actually no action behind them, I could later on post in the chat for people somewhere. We've expanded on that in much greater detail. Something written for Chatham House in March 2023 called Russian Nuclear Intimidation, How Russia Shapes Western Responses to something or other. But chapter and verse on exactly how this works. And the answer to your question, how is it that the West has arrived at this situation where they are so convinced that what Russia is saying is true as a success? The problem when it comes to NATO Article 5 is, if you consider all of the reasons why the United States in particular is hesitant about supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression, vast quantities of aid, but with conditions on them, and of course the endless foot dragging over supplying the particular weapon systems that Ukraine identifies as essential so that it does not upset Russia, Now, consider another country that is under attack from Russia. Consider another neighbor like Poland, like Finland, like Estonia. Exactly the same criteria will apply in US decision making if the upcoming Trump purges don't completely change the foreign policy thinking within the National Security Council, the Pentagon, etc. The same criteria, the same reasons not to allow those countries to defend themselves to the best of their abilities. The only difference is NATO Article 5. And anybody that has actually read NATO Article 5 will understand that that is no reassurance whatsoever, because it is so incredibly vague as to what countries actually have to do to protect each other.
At the same time, what's all the more frightening is this lack of political interest in the United States in what's going on in Europe. We had, to a certain degree, under Obama, this pitch a movement towards the Pacific as a focus. But now here you have a president who's made it very clear that he might not actually defend a NATO country. He's actually gone out and said it, which leaves Europe in a very difficult position. You conclude it's got to be able possibly to defend itself without US backing.
Yes, and let's be clear, this problem does not start with Trump. The United States has been saying loud and clear to anybody that's actually been willing to listen for a number of years now that Europe is slipping down its list of global priorities in terms of the security threats and challenges that it sees around the world. Now, you mentioned, of course, the Far East, but, of course, since this reluctance to confront Russia since 2022 onwards, conflicts have proliferated around the world because other bad people around the world have seen their opportunity, because the United States is restraining itself from exerting that stabilizing influence that it might have done previously. So that effect has accelerated. There's now more competition for resources and attention between the global commanders of US forces for dealing with the challenges in their region. And particularly with the conflict in the Middle East, we've seen the clearest possible demonstration of which parts of the world matter to the United States and which do not, because you have direct comparisons between what the United States will do to protect Israel, which is not a NATO member, versus what it will do to protect Ukraine, also not a NATO member. Notionally the same status, but every single time you have that comparison, the United States mobilizes its resources and its coalition partners to protect Israel, but refuses to do so for Ukraine. Like keeping shipping lanes open in the Red Sea, but refusing to do it for the Black Sea. Like intercepting drones and missiles that are inbound to Israel over third countries, refusing to do that for Ukraine. And there are direct comparisons in terms of the responses to some of the things that are happening to Israel that demonstrate the point very clearly, such as, for example, April of last year, the first major wave of Iranian drones attacking Israel. Immediate response from the United States, apart from shooting them down and defending Israel, was to sanction the Iranian drone manufacturers. Now, what Ukrainians notice is that those same drones had been being used for a year previously to kill civilians in Ukraine itself, with no response from the United States. And the conclusion they draw is that there's only one logical way to interpret that the United States cares more about Israel than it does about Europe.
I'd love to start taking questions, please. So if you can put your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat, or just raise your hand, and then you'll be able to put your questions directly to Keir Giles. Can you just give us, I want to sort of home in on some sort of more concrete examples, and then talk about European spending, the lack of European capacity to deal with this threat, and then go on to the areas where you think we are most vulnerable and how Russia might seek to undermine NATO allies. So just to start with, I want to talk about Grant Shapps. I think you're not really a fan of. That's the UK's former defence minister, who talked about the UK's airlift capacity, and he made quite a big boast about that. And I think you cite it in your book too.
It's probably a little unfair to say I'm not a fan of Grant Shapps, because he was, like other defense ministers before and after him, saying the right thing about what needed to be done to confront Russia. It was simply that level of understanding of what the challenge was and how to meet it stopped at minister level, defense minister, minister of the armed forces, and did not reach the level at which something could be done about it, which is prime minister, chancellor of the exchequer. So who's going to decide to do it? Who's going to decide how to spend money on it? That was completely unaffected. But Grant Shapps was definitely on the right page. What you're referring to, I think, was almost certainly drafted for him by another of these Ministry of Defense civil servants that have been compulsively pumping out fiction about the defense preparedness of the United Kingdom and how much is being spent on it for as long as anybody can remember. And in this particular case, the easily demonstrable fiction shot down immediately by any number of defense commentators was that the RAF at the time of this tweet allegedly had the most airlift capacity it had ever had. Which was a complete lie because just the year before they had completely chopped their entire fleet of C-130 Hercules. So it had disappeared altogether with a massive drop in actual airlift capacity. So it's things like that where, and especially with announcements on defense spending that have completely undermined the credibility of the UK MOD, of course, not only with the public, but also with the armed forces they're supposed to administer.
For many people, this idea of the conflict in Western Europe is, as you say, it's far away. But you also make the point that this actually is already here. We can talk about, and some people listening in or watching may be aware of this, a DHL, a parcel going off in a warehouse in Birmingham. But perhaps other people also may be aware of the more recent crash of a transport plane flying from Germany to, I think, Lithuania. That was just in November. And the finger here is being pointing at Russia. What's Russia doing here?
Well, first of all, it has not been confirmed that that crash of another DHL aircraft outside Vilnius was, in fact, caused by Russian sabotage. That is, for the time being, still just a circumstantial possible additional element to this. What has been established is that Russia has planted incendiary devices on aircraft heading to a number of destinations and was doing it as a trial run for eventually making those destinations North America, the United States and Canada. Now, that indicates a willingness by the Russian intelligence services that we had noticed was previously absent to cause incidents which trigger mass casualties among the target populations. The recklessness with which you put an incendiary device on an aircraft is comparable to back in 2018 when Russian intelligence officers, serving military officers, abandoned sufficient Novichok in Salisbury to, we're told, kill tens of thousands of people. But what it means is that the threat is undeniable and immediate, and of course it has already caused significant disruption because air transport shipments to Canada and the United States have been suffering significant interference because of additional security requirements. It's also shown up the differences between European states in terms of how they handle Russian ongoing arson and sabotage and terrorist attacks. There are some countries which are very keen on making all of these incidents public so that the public can be aware of them and so that it is easier to prosecute them. There are other countries which prefer to keep it all under wraps for as long as possible. So you had not just the incendiary device you were referring to in Birmingham, also another one in Leipzig. Also, we understand others that have been detected. It wasn't the British or the German intelligence services that actually blew the whistle on this. It was the Poles, again, who pointed out that this was part of a longer running campaign.
So, I mean, essentially, what reinforces the idea is not necessarily the idea of Russian troops walking into, Tallinn or in Estonia or somewhere near the closer to home, but the possibility of, well, we use the term hybrid, other means of warfare, which hybrid is a sort of glossy word for it. It's warfare, but it's used in a way that it's unconventional.
Well, hybrid, unconventional, grey zone, subthreshold, liminal warfare, all of these different adjectives that have been applied to specific ways in which Russia kills people are convenient because they allow people to pretend that we're not at war, because they allow politicians to avoid the really uncomfortable decisions about how to respond to some things that are undeniable acts of war that we've seen not just since 2022, but dating back to 2014. In fact, I know previously we had a conversation about my last book there, Russia's War on Everybody, talking about the ways in which Russia is waging war without it being admitted to by the victim countries. But there are steps beyond this. There are ways in which the current campaign, if you disregard some of the the outliers, like the random attacks on shopping centers, warehouses, burning things down for no particular reason. The core of all of these attacks, the central theme seems to be paralyzing Europe and paralyzing emergency response, immobilizing cities and countries so that if there is an attack by Russia on a frontline state, it's impossible for anybody to move to the site of where they need to be. Armed forces can't transit Europe if you've shut down entire logistics systems by cyber attacks and sabotage on railways, by shutting down air transport through the threat of incendiary devices, by activists on borders, by all of the different things that we identified in the previous decade that Russia could do to shut down Europe without actually launching a missile at it. But then, of course, what happens when Russia does actually want to influence that conversation among European states about how to respond to Russia? If there is an Article 5 discussion, or even if there is consideration of a country further away from Russia, like, for example, the UK, deciding whether or not to move to the site of the action and support a country under attack, how might Russia seek to influence that decision, possibly through what they refer to as a strategic operation for destruction of critically important targets, as Sod said, something that we've seen demonstrated time and again in Ukraine, simply launching demonstrative missile strikes, non-nuclear missile strikes, against things that keep people alive in the target country. Now, how would Keir Starmer respond if you suddenly have Russian missiles appearing out of the Atlantic or from the Arctic Ocean, landing on the kindergartens and maternity hospitals in Birmingham instead of in Kyiv? How would he respond when people protest because the lights have gone out? Is he going to find that resolve that we've seen demonstrated so clearly in Ukraine to withstand Russia at the cost of losing the popularity among his own voters about which he cares so much?
These are really shocking thoughts to think about. We've focused on European weakness, on lack of direction, the failure to deal with threat, but Russia too is struggling. It's not as though, we talked earlier about the military failures. It's now the conflict has been ramped up. But back home, the economy is under severe pressure, isn't it?
Yes and no. Part of the problem is that we have these constant predictions that the Russian economy is going to collapse and Russia will therefore fall out of the war. The trouble is they tend to come from the people who have predicted that every year since about 2015 without it happening, because there is a significant amount of optimism bias. Russia started the war with immense financial reserves and enough to spend on running the war for a significant period. And then, of course, those have been topped up by the energy revenues from both their new and their old customers for energy, even at a discounted rate, including, of course, some coming from Europe itself. And it's only been very belatedly, just in the last few days, that some of those methods of collecting energy revenues through sanctions busting on oil have finally been targeted by the United States. Again, another demonstration of how this is not as big a priority for the United States as some might have hoped. So Russia appears able at least to maintain what it is doing for the foreseeable future and longer than any other country might be able to, particularly Ukraine might be able to withstand the attacks. We also have to factor in, of course, the fact that Russia historically and currently has much deeper reserves of tolerance for economically unsustainable conditions and for the immiseration of its population than any Western democracy would do. And they've demonstrated very clearly that actually it's the war that matters, not the long-term economic or social or even physical health of their population. So Russia is giving every sign that it will push on well past the point at which any Western country would say, this is economically devastating for us and we have to stop.
In a second, we'll talk about the implications of a settlement in Ukraine, what that means for the rest of Europe and the world. But let's take a very good question from Deirdre Holding. Go ahead, Deirdre.
Well, this probably is a silly question, but why does Russia want more land? What would it do with European land if it took it over?
Great question, I think.
Well, there's no such thing as a silly question. Yes, this is key to the whole thing. And again, it's a question that if you're looking at this from the point of view of 21st century Western politicians or general public, it makes no sense at all, because this territorial expansion, this empire building is supposed to be something from another century. But we need to remember that Russia and its leaders are living mentally in that other century. We used to be asked quite a lot before the start of this full-scale war. What is it exactly that Putin wants? What does Russia want? And if, as often happened, we only have a few seconds to answer, we would generally say they want it to be 1914 again. Because in 1914, the Russia that exists in Putin's mind and in the minds of so many Russians alongside him was accepted and understood by the rest of the world. It was a great power. It had a global influence, and it had an empire. It ruled over the countries that were around it. Now, when I when I discuss this with military audiences and they love their PowerPoint and their slideshows, I put up a couple of maps which really help explain this different mental geography that Putin and many Russians have. A map of the Russian Empire in 1914. Very different to the map of Russia that we see in our atlases today, because it includes the Baltic states, the Caucasus, Ukraine, Belarus, Finland, Poland, etc. And then straight after that, fast forward 100 years, I use a map, a children's war map that's been on sale in Moscow since about 2015. It's called Karta Nashei Rodiny, Map of Our Motherland. And the point is, it's the same as the 1914 map. The motherland, mentally, includes all of those countries that we think of as being sovereign, independent nations, full-fledged members of NATO and the EU, and nothing to do with Russia. And yet, here they are presented by President Putin as being Russia's natural birthright. So if you think back to February 2022, and the night before they launched the full-scale invasion, Putin goes on television with an extremely long, rambling speech explaining why he's doing this. And he says he wants to correct the historical mistakes that were made by the early Bolsheviks 90 years beforehand when they set up within the USSR the constituent republics, drawing lines on the map more or less corresponding to the people that were living there. And of course, those lines on the map more or less correspond with the countries that we now see as sovereign and independent from Russia, because the people living there are, by and large, not Russians. That, he said, was what he wanted to correct, and he was going to start with Ukraine. So the problem is that he and many Russians like him think that with the lines on the map we see today are a mistake, and it is time to set them right. Of course, for the millions of people that actually live in those countries that Russia wants back, that's an immediate problem.
I've got a question in two parts, which is, what do you think the possible parameters of a settlement are, as the United States might propose or wish, and what are the risks that Putin runs? We have to remember that he is now the number one, he's been the number one person in Russia for a very long time, but it's all focused on him. There's this enormous pyramid, and it's not like he has the oligarchs to blame and other governors to blame and other people around him to blame, say it was their fault or this person's fault. The buck stops with him. So if the settlement doesn't shine glory upon him or is seen as acceptable, it's very risky for him too.
Well, it depends what kind of settlement, of course. Now, the key question, and the thing that is most alarming for not just Ukraine, but the rest of Eastern Europe as well, is the United States in a position to force through some kind of end to major combat operations in Ukraine, which doesn't deter Russia from having another go later? And this is the so-called security guarantees for Ukraine that we hear so much about. Because if Trump decides that it is acceptable from the point of view of his own reputation to just say, look, I've stopped the fighting, but that doesn't actually solve the problems that led to the fighting in the first place, Russia is able to rebuild its forces very much faster without Ukraine continually eroding and destroying them through the ongoing fighting. So that means the brakes are off and the clock is ticking for Russia's next move, about which there seems to be an unprecedented consensus across the whole of NATO. You have chiefs of defense, military intelligence chiefs, service chiefs, all saying, yes, our assessment, based on our intelligence, is that Russia is next looking at a NATO state to attack. So a ceasefire with no guarantees that is actually a genuine ceasefire will just make the situation more dangerous, particularly because there's a strong risk that it would follow the previous pattern that we've seen repeated over and over again in places like Georgia in 2008, Syria in 2015, 2016, Ukraine under the Minsk agreements, Ukraine itself, where it's outside powers that broker an agreement between Russia and the victim of Russian aggression by imposing on the victim a ceasefire that's been drafted in Moscow, because the objectives of the two sides are very, very different. The outside power, whether it's France, Germany, the United States, whoever it's been in all of these different examples, wants to end the fighting. Russia instead wants to win the war. And so the ceasefire is imposed. It has loopholes so big Russia can drive tanks through it, which it continues to do. And the one thing you can guarantee is that just because Russia has signed a ceasefire agreement, it doesn't mean that they're actually going to cease firing. So there is a lot of danger involved in ending major combat operations at the moment. If it happens on the wrong terms, it makes Ukraine's situation and Eastern Europe's situation worse, not better. And even more dangerous, it gives the rest of Europe an excuse to pretend that the problem has been solved and look elsewhere.
Yeah, okay. Marty Ryan, question from you, please.
You've spoken about the need to change the mindset of Europeans and Americans regarding this threat from Russia. And what do you think it will take to make that happen? Is it going to need to be a very large attack, or is there some other way to get people to think differently?
Well, first of all, let's stress it's not all Europeans. There are plenty of people in the continent, and more of them as you go eastwards, that are under no doubt at all about how serious the problem is and are doing the right things about it. I mentioned Poland and its crash rearmament. In Estonia, people understand why they are paying more taxes to support defense. In fact, the reference colloquially is to a Putin tax, because that's what costs them money. Simply living next to Russia means that it is more expensive and more difficult to run a country. And if you remove Russia, of course, you remove the hard security threat for the entire continent. But specifically on your question, this too is something that comes up again and again because of this refusal by some Western European governments, particularly the one in the UK at the moment, to actually admit the threat. And the conclusion we come to again and again is that, yes, as you suggested, it will take a disaster. It'll take a substantial loss of life to make the problem undeniable. And it follows the pattern that we've seen elsewhere, where there's a tendency to ignore a problem until it is thrust in governments' faces by people dying, whether it is the threat of terrorism from various sources, whether it's COVID. This is a pattern that we've seen again and again, because some governments think it is more risky to tamper with their spending priorities and reallocate from things that they spend their budget on towards defense than it is to risk total catastrophic national defeat.
But Keir, I think it would be a miscalculation, possibly. What Russia wants to do is to try and chip away, is to pull off one NATO member from another, do things that cause so division rather than provoke unity.
Absolutely. And nobody is suggesting, except in the really wild fantasies, that Russia would actually want to take on the whole of NATO. That is absolutely something they have been very firmly avoiding for as long as possible. So it's not a military defeat of NATO as a whole that we're concerned about. It's a political defeat by doing exactly what you're saying, by isolating a victim and then engineering a situation, or being confident that the situation is already there, where the rest of NATO will not come to their aid. And there are any number of political ways in which Russia could do this, with and without nuclear threats. The problem is that as soon as Russia succeeds in that once, the whole raison d'etre for NATO, the whole rationale for its existence, collapses because it has been tested and it's shown not to actually work. And after that, of course, Russia has won, because it can target individual countries that won't have that formal guarantee of support from their allies. And then, of course, we're dependent, as we have been so many times in the past, on coalitions of the least unwilling to stand up for the security of the continent as a whole.
We're going to wrap up in just over 5 minutes. So if you've got questions, please do put them in fairly promptly. I've got one from Alan Livingston. We'll get him up in just a second. But we've got Alex Norris as well. Alex, who works with us. Alex, go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been fascinating. I just wanted to ask if, from a European standpoint, with your thesis that the U.S. is withdrawing and that leaves them on their own, essentially, is the mindset one of regaining deterrence, or is it one of building up defensive capabilities to, I guess, what's the psychology right now? Are you going for deterrence, stopping a future invasion, or are you looking just to build up defenses so that if they do invade, it's not successful, or that they can mitigate the losses?
Keir, can you give us a brief assessment of European defence? I mean, we don't have lift capability, we don't have satellite capacity, we don't have, surveillance operations in the way that the United States does. I mean, we are a very, very, very poor cousin.
If the US declines to provide all of those capabilities that have underpinned so much of what NATO does, and so many European nations have decided that they're too expensive, they're not going to bother with them, then that has potentially an even greater impact than withdrawal of the limited numbers of US troops currently in Europe, because of the way in which so many European militaries have contracted and eliminated those enablers, those support functions. The UK, for example, which notionally is supposed to provide multiple divisions, to NATO in the event of crisis, but actually only has enough enablers to support a small part of them. So in terms of the question of is it defense or is it deterrence, of course, the two overlap. If you make yourself a sufficiently hard target by demonstrating that the costs for Russia of a military move would be too high, then, of course, you have successfully achieved deterrence because they're going to look elsewhere. But the impact of that, of course, is that all of those countries that are taking the problem seriously and are in the front line thereby make themselves less likely to be attacked because there are much softer targets further afield, including...
Give us a concrete example. Sorry to interrupt. So you were talking about softer targets further afield, but what kind of, if your response, whether you're United States or Europe, do you blow up the Black Sea Fleet? Do you destroy power infrastructure? I mean, this is really tricky stuff here. How do you actually show that deterrence?
There's a huge, are we talking about how to deter Russia?
Yeah.
Well, the hands off Ukraine in terms of allowing them to strike unrestricted would be a good start. And let's look at the number of different ways in which they have been held back from using the capabilities at their disposal, or even discouraged from using indigenous, homegrown capabilities to strike at, for example, Russia's oil industry, which has been keeping the money coming in to keep Russia's war effort going. And the United States says, no, please don't do that. So it's a hands-off approach, and being creative about the different points of pressure that are actually available within Russia would go a long way. But we simply haven't seen it demonstrated yet because of the constraints that we've seen applied so far.
Right, got it. Alan Livingston. Alan, just need to open your microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Yes. Yes. Is there any future for pro-Western movements in Moldova and in Georgia? Areas like that, or is that just dead from the start?
Well, you've got to worry about Romania too. Moldova's
right.
Moldova's possibly the easier one to deal with first, than Georgia. So we'll start with Moldova.
Well, sadly, the common pattern for all of them is a demonstration that Russia doesn't need to roll tanks across the border to achieve what it wants in terms of direct or indirect control. And that is a problem that has been, it's not been overlooked throughout the previous history of trying to contain Russian power. But the nature of democracies is such that very few actually think that they're actually capable of defending against what is happening. And state capture by those means, and ensuring that a Russia-friendly regime, once it is installed in power, pulls up the drawbridge behind it to ensure that it cannot be dislodged, is something that we've seen repeatedly play out of our history beforehand, which meant that in Georgia, everybody could see it coming, but still felt powerless to actually do anything about it. And that, I fear, is a pattern that could be repeated over and over again across Europe. And it is equally as much a threat as the Russian military buildup that we've been talking about for most of this hour.
Absolutely. I think that's the point where to leave it, everyone. It's been an absolutely a fantastic discussion. I'm just going to produce Keir's book here again, Who'll Defend Europe, which is available through Hearst. I have only just got hold of it, so I've been racing through parts of it, and I look forward to finishing it. But thank you very much indeed, Keir. It's a very wide-reaching and worrying conversation. I hope other people read your book, and I hope Europe wakes up.
Thank you, Nicholas, and I'm glad you're looking forward to finishing it. I'm afraid it's not a happy ending.
Oh dear. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thanks so much indeed.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.